Hi. Coverage of the Meghan and Harry story has been extensive in the British press in recent days. Of course, Harry and Meghan need no introduction. They're probably the most famous couple in the world right now. It's been extensive, and to some extent, this is the fact that our newspapers, particularly the red top press, the tabloids, have always been fascinated by the royal family, but also because the implications are genuinely quite profound. Um, as an example of this, Prince William responded to he was at an event and someone asked if his family was racist. I mean, what's anyone going to say to a question like that? Yeah, we're racists. Of course, he's not going to say that. But the very fact that he responded at all shows that they are thinking about it. And how could they not? There's one aspect of the whole thing which makes me uneasy, and I think it was Joanna Lumley said this, that the public airing of family differences, whatever side you're on, whatever perspective you take on this, um, no one ends up being the winners. I do think that whatever merits the Sussexes might have in their arguments, to air it so publicly. I mean, this interview's been seen tens of millions of times in the United States, the UK, and in other countries. Them to to take that approach, I do think is it's hard not to be cynical about that. Even for a famous family like the Windsors, it's just the British royal family. To do it that way just seems questionable. Um, I suppose they would argue if they didn't do an interview, then there'd be continued questions over them leaving the firm. But there is a particular aspect of this I want to talk about a little bit because I think there's a lot of angles to look at with it, and that is the press and press coverage, not just of Harry and Meghan, but more generally with the royal family. Um, Recently, I made the video about Piers Morgan. I defend Morgan to an extent, but one thing I dislike about Piers Morgan is his long record of basically being an apologist for press um, sensitiveness, for want of another word. That's probably not the best word to use. Um, Piers Morgan, you know, he will always defend the press no matter what. Yet in his insider diaries, at the time of Diana's death, he admitted that he was given paparazzi photos that he wouldn't publish. So even he knows that there are certain things that even tabloid editors will draw a line at. Yet Piers Morgan had a very questionable role in the phone hacking scandal, to which he didn't come out entirely squeaky clean. And I still don't think he's been entirely vindicated from that. Um, but he's just a high profile example. There's others, of course, in the world of Fleet Street and the print press in this country. Very powerful. It's interesting. I mentioned Diana, and regarding the events in France, there's a curious phenomenon. The print press in France is far, far more respectful of private lives. And in France, I understand there are quite strict libel laws regarding privacy, but apparently the implications of this are quite minor. In other words, if a celebrity, whether a politician or a public figure in France, feels if privacy has been violated, they can sue the publication in question. But the fines are so small that they're not really a deterrent. So maybe it's not that different from our situation. Um, Although France has some quite thriving newspapers, I don't think their print press are as powerful as they are in the UK. But the paparazzi in France were particularly notorious in the late 1990s. And of course, a paparazzi, it's an Italian word, but they can be any nationality. Most of them tend to be French, American, Italian, some Britons as well. They're pretty international, but they're mostly Europeans and Americans, the odd Australian, Canadian, from what I can tell. And I'm sure Asia and other parts of the world have their equivalents. I know in Hong Kong there's been issues about the press in the past regarding celebrity stories. Not to distract. So, even British tabloids were amazed at the extent to which the paparazzi would go. And you can see the footage. I've seen tourist footage of the night that Diana died, and the paparazzi clustering around the hotel, around the Ritz like flies. Very aggressive. I was watching footage actually of the night of the crash, like news reports, and it kind of angered me how senior people in the media, royal correspondents, tabloid people, were basically criticizing Diana's entourage for not being responsible. This was as the news was breaking, as it was reported that Dodi had died and the others were at that time injured. They were actually saying, "Oh well, it's mildly annoying, but they should be trained to deal with the situation." That really, I thought was quite striking as to um, the arrogance that some in the tabloid industry have, that they have a right to stop people. I mean, you cannot divorce tabloid journalism from the paparazzi because there is a long-standing record of tabloid editors buying paparazzi photos, and every British tabloid has been guilty of it. So it's not totally divorced. Just because the British tabloids kind of behaved themselves after her death doesn't mean that, they never bought photos of Diana. They did, and they still do this. They still buy photos that are clearly taken by paparazzi stalkers. And I think that 24 years on, that's one lesson that hasn't been learned. Paparazzi are still normalized as photographers. I mean, technically they're photographers, but I really think that they should be regarded as no different from stalkers. Um, we heard that tragic story about the young woman who was murdered in London. And possibly that involved stalking, we don't know. But for regular people, a stalker is that a criminal, someone who follows their victim and makes them feel very uncomfortable and is potentially dangerous. Yet the paparazzi do pretty much the same thing, all to get that photograph. They're not above putting children in the way of harm or, um, really, really intimidating people. I remember at the time of the News of the World inquiries, um, Sienna Miller, the actress Sienna Miller, stated that she was dealing with lots of men, male paparazzi, stalking her across London. Um, So I really think that I personally actually would go so far as to say it should be illegal for newspapers to buy paparazzi photos. I think it's, and then what's ironic? The same newspapers would probably have a story about stalking. So there's a great deal of hypocrisy there. I don't see any circumstance, any, where the behavior of the paparazzi can be condoned. And people who say, well, oh, the famous want the attention. I cannot imagine anyone unless they're very mentally unstable, would want a stranger ramming a camera in their face outside their home with maybe their children present. It's the same reason I deeply dislike the practice of doorstepping. I think it's sleazy. I think it's definitely paparazzi-esque, even though supposedly mainstream journalists do it. I remonstrated actually with Nick Ferrari on LBC about this, and he said, "Oh, it's the only way to get a story sometimes." But my retort was, well, if a public figure isn't returning calls or isn't giving a statement, then just report that and let the public judge for themselves. Let us say, okay, well, they're avoiding the questions. Fine. But I don't think there's any justification for stalking in that way. And that's how I see it. So when Harry was talking about the press, I wouldn't entirely dismiss that. However, and this is a big however, there is another side to it. Um, Harry and Meghan and Princess Diana, they all courted the press as well. So therein lies double standards on their part. I mean, it's an uncomfortable fact, but Princess Diana courted the press and she herself gave the press information about where she would be and so on, just as much as she loathed them. I think the loathing was sincere. I think she did hate being pursued everywhere, but at the same time, I think she had almost a childlike quality where she wanted the attention and she understood that her fame and the attention that the paparazzi brought and the press brought helped her to raise awareness of the causes that she was interested. Some have been very cynical about that. They said that she was only doing it for herself. I don't agree with that. I think she was genuinely compassionate. I think she was a genuinely compassionate person. But I do think that she did use the press to some extent. Um, and I think there's no question that Harry and Meghan have as well to raise the sort of issues they care about, like you know, um, rights of children, the rights of women, poverty, and green issues. They've been very vocal on those sort of things, and it's been pointed out that a lot of this rift with the press began when there started being blowback against them taking private flights. Now, if you look at 2018, you look at the coverage at that time, it was overwhelmingly positive. I've got the newspapers from the royal wedding, and it was universally welcoming, with perhaps the odd critical article about the extent of coverage. But in terms of being welcoming to the royal couple and to particularly, Meghan Markle as a bride, it was, I don't think anyone could rationally say that was negative. So, you know, there's this phrase that the woke left like to use, like her truth, her reality. If I hold up this lighter, okay, that's kind of a neon green color. Now, you can't say, oh, well, that's a red lighter, that's my truth. No, it's a neon green color. Might be debate over the shade, but okay, I'll use another example. This keyring has a panda on it. Now, you can't say that's an elephant just because it's your truth. The truth is that is a panda. So I have a problem with this idea of her truth because there is only one truth. There could be her experience and how she felt about things, but that isn't the same as fact. It's just not. Human emotions and the human brain is a very complex thing. And as advocates of mental health, they know that. So I don't doubt that she might have been depressed at times. That isn't the same as saying it's the truth, it's the fact she had no support. Um, there are a lot of things in that interview that don't add up and have been contradicted subsequently. For one, the fact that they supposedly had a private marriage or a private wedding before the big public one. If that's true, then, well, the Archbishop of Canterbury, not particularly helpfully, has refused to comment on it. If that's true, then either it or the main wedding would have been illegitimate. It would have been illegal as a sham wedding. In this country, you can't get married in a church twice. Not in that way. Um, my father's a clergyman. He's performed weddings. You can't do that. So that raises questions. Um, some of the negative press coverage that she's mentioned being citing as a reason for them to leave. Some of those reports were in after they left. So that's just a contradiction. But when Harry talks about the press coverage forcing them to leave, I think he's really drawing on emotions here. He's drawing on what happened to his mother. And it's very hard, to be unsympathetic to that because this is a guy who, as a boy, really, he was 13 years old, 12, 13 years old. Um, he had to go through a horrendous ordeal. He had to go through the death of his mother. in tragic circumstances at a young age in the eyes of the world. So, of course, that would have had a profound effect on him. And I totally 100% understand Harry's, or sympathise with Harry's animosity to the press, knowing how his mother was hounded. But I also feel that to some extent he is using that as a way to deflect legitimate criticism in a way that his brother isn't. And many would say that Prince William's been more um, balanced in his handling of the press, if we can put it that way. But there is a compelling argument now. If they really, really want to practice what they preach and live their own lives, then maybe they should renounce their royal titles, because that interview was inflammatory. So why not have the freedom? Renounce your royal titles. They're still very wealthy people. They'll have good lives. You know, um, some have compared this to the abdication crisis. Well, even the Duke and Duchess of Windsor didn't make such publicly inflammatory claims about the royal family as Harry and Meghan have. Anyway, I'll just conclude this. So when it comes to the press, I'm very torn because on one hand, I see the point of view of the press that, well, wait a second, we were welcome and we were positive. Um, and when it suited them, we covered the sort of issues that they wanted to cover. It's just that when the criticism began, then, they turned on us. On the other hand, for editors to say they have never ever been racist or never ever been, cruel is just a lie. Anyone who knows the British tabloids will know that is BS. They have a very long track record of cruel reporting, not just about Harry and Meghan, it goes back a long way. Just as an example, on the mental health issue, the way they covered, The Sun covered the boxer Frank Bruno, they had a notorious headline, Bunkers Bruno, when he was admitted to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. That's how the tabloids treated mental health. So for them to say that they've never been cruel, they've never been racist, it's just BS. I think that the claim about racism regarding Meghan might be dubious, but to claim they've never been racist, that is just the way they vilified migrants, for example, over the years. I would say is unquestionably racist. Dehumanizing them, dehumanizing language. A typical Express headline would be 1,000 more illegals apprehended. Um, there's just a certain approach that tabloids take that can be very ugly. So, as much as I do have cynicism about this interview, and I do have some trust issues with Meghan Markle, I do think that, she is possibly quite a manipulative person. Having said that, I certainly wouldn't want to be a cheerleader for the British tabloids. There's definitely things that they do that I don't condone. And any tabloid editor who's ever taken a paparazzi photo, you know, they've no right to pontificate because no matter how famous someone is, no matter how much they might court the press, the notion that having a bunch of strangers follow you around a city aggressively, even, ramming cameras into your house and stuff like that, nothing will ever convince me that's justified. And I personally think that there needs to be a much harder line against paparazzi. I see them as no different from stalkers. Um, and I get quite frustrated when they're normalised as photographers. They're stalkers, that's what they are. And if editors of our red top press are really as professional as they claim, they wouldn't accept any paparazzi photos. You can criticise public figures without accepting those sort of pictures. So I don't know. There's a lot of ways to look at this. Um, I do think that the way they went to, as someone put it, actually, this is a fair point. They criticize tabloid newspapers, but what about tabloid television? I mean, let's face it, that show Oprah's whole style is quite tabloidy. It's very sensationalistic. And there was dishonesty in it. I mean, the thing about Archie's title, that goes back to a constitutional um, issue that George V introduced, convention, I should say, which is that only the sons and the children of the heir and the heir to the throne on the male side can get royal titles. That's why Princess Anne's children don't have formal royal titles. Princess Anne's daughter is just Sarah Phillips. You know, she's not Princess Sarah Phillips. She's not Duchess Sarah Phillips. They just Sarah Phillips. And there's other examples within the royal family. So this idea that Archie's being discriminated against because he's mixed race, it's a fabrication, and it's one of the many distortions that was made in that interview, which Americans are now lapping up. A lot of Americans, I should say, not all Americans, but unfortunately, the American left are totally lapping this up. All I'm saying is that I do think there was a lot of distortion in that interview. But on the issue of the press, I'm not going to go out of my way to defend the British tabloids. Yes, there is hypocrisy from Harry and Meghan, but on the wider issues, they cannot play innocent. They can't. And I'll leave it there.